They shoved him against the wall, laughed, called him worthless. But in 6 seconds he dismantled 3 men trained to kill. Not with strength, with precision. And when the gang leader dropped to his knees, shaking, Frank simply said, "You picked the wrong veteran." That was the moment everyone understood. This old man was never unarmed. Re-watch that scene. Look into his eyes. Drop a comment. Would you have stood against Frankins or apologized? They thought age meant weakness, that grey hair meant fragility, that a slow walk and a wrinkled face meant the fire had long died out. They were wrong. When Frank Morgan stepped through the iron gates of Black Ridge Penitentiary, he didn't look like a threat. 67 years old, slim, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes calm but distant. Just another old man shuffled into a place built for predators. He didn't speak as the guards processed him, didn't flinch when they barked orders. His eyes scanned the concrete, the rusted bars, the gang markings on the walls, not with fear but with recognition, as if he'd seen worse, as if this wasn't new. The cell doors slammed behind him, echoing like a war drum through the hallway. Block C, the worst of them all, the place where respect was taken, never given. A jungle in steel and stone, where the strong ruled and the weak were entertainment. Frank was assigned a bottom bunk in the corner of the cell block. No one helped, no one greeted. That's how it worked here. You sink or swim. And they all assumed he would sink. First to notice him was Tyrell. 25, lean but strong, eyes sharp with arrogance, leader of a small crew of loud-mouthed, muscle-flexing troublemakers who spent their days picking off the weak for sport. He laughed when he saw Frank unpacking slowly. "Yo, Gramps," he shouted loud enough for the whole block to hear. "You get lost on the way to the retirement home?" Laughter exploded around the room. Frank didn't respond. He just kept folding his blanket with the kind of precision you'd expect from a man who still believed in order. "Hey, don't ignore me, old-timer. Where's your cane at? You need a walker to get to the toilet?" More laughter. Tyrell strutted over with 2 of his boys, Dre and Mikey, both built like linebackers. Tyrell stood inches from Frank now, sneering, looking for a reaction. Frank glanced up, briefly, calmly, then looked away. That silence, that composure, it made Tyrell angrier. "Look at this dude. Thinks he's too good to talk?" He shoved Frank's folded blanket to the floor. "You're in my block now, Grandpa. You eat when I say, you sleep when I say." Still, nothing. Just a look. One of those long, heavy stares that doesn't need words, like he was watching a child throw a tantrum. "You deaf, old man?" Tyrell snapped his fingers in Frank's face. "Or just slow?" Frank bent down, picked up his blanket, folded it again just as carefully, and laid it on the bed. It wasn't defiance. It was something worse. It was dignity. Tyrell didn't know it yet, but he'd already lost the upper hand. The next morning, the cafeteria was buzzing with noise, trays clattering, inmates shouting, guards pretending to care. Frank sat alone at the end of a table, eating slowly. He didn't look up when Tyrell and his crew walked in, but they saw him. "Yo, our new granddad is enjoying his applesauce," Mikey laughed. They walked over like vultures circling a fresh corpse. Tyrell snatched the tray off Frank's table and dumped the food onto the floor. "Oops." Frank stared at the mess on the floor, then looked back up at Tyrell, slowly. "That was your breakfast." Tyrell grinned. "You're gonna go hungry now." Frank stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, just calm. He looked at the guards who weren't even pretending to watch. Then he sat back down. Didn't say a word. Didn't show a flicker of anger. And that quiet, that refusal to break, it got under Tyrell's skin like poison. Because a man who doesn't fear humiliation is not the kind of man you want to push. But Tyrell didn't know that yet. He thought he was in control. He thought this old man was just another easy target. But what he didn't know was that this moment would change everything. Forever. 3 days in, and the routine was already set. Every morning, Frank woke up before the others, folded his sheets, brushed his teeth in silence, waited for the door buzz at 7 a.m., ate whatever slop was served, kept his head down, eyes open. In prison, some men talked too much, others talked too little. But the ones who watched everything in silence, those were the ones to be careful with. Unfortunately for Tyrell, he was too young to know that kind of wisdom. He saw Frank as weak, quiet, alone, a perfect punching bag to boost his image. By the 4th day, it became sport. In the yard, Frank was leaning against the wall reading a tattered book. The sun was beating down, the concrete radiating heat like an oven. Tyrell walked past with his crew, loud and swaggering. "You really bringing books out here like it's Sunday school?" Tyrell snatched the book from Frank's hand. Frank didn't reach for it. He simply said with a voice flat and cool, "Give it back." Tyrell looked surprised. "What was that, Gramps?" "I said," Frank repeated, standing slowly. "Give it back." Tyrell raised an eyebrow. "And what you gonna do if I don't? Tell your bingo club?" Laughter again. Louder this time. Frank stepped forward once. Just once. Tyrell didn't back off, but something in him tightened. Just for a second. The old man's eyes weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They were calm. Dead calm. Tyrell flipped the book open. "Look at this crap. Ain't even got pictures in it." He tossed it over his shoulder. It landed in a puddle. Frank didn't move. He just looked at the wet book, then back at Tyrell. "You done?" he asked. Tyrell scoffed, turned his back, and walked off like he'd won something. But that look stayed with him. That stillness. He couldn't shake it. Later that night, during lights out, Dre whispered through the darkness. "Yo, that dude gives me the creeps, man." Mikey laughed. "Creeps? He's a damn fossil, bro." "No, for real. He don't react, he don't flinch, like, what kind of man doesn't even blink when you push him?" Tyrell rolled over in his bunk, annoyed. "He's old. That's all. We keep pressing, he'll break." But deep down, even Tyrell was starting to feel it. That itch in his gut. That something wrong feeling you can't explain. And yet, the next morning, he pushed again. This time, it got physical. Frank was waiting in line for food. Tyrell came up behind him and shoved him hard. Not playfully, not joking. Frank stumbled forward, caught himself, and straightened. He turned slowly, looked Tyrell dead in the eyes. There was no fear, just something heavy. "I'm telling you," Frank said low and slow, "don't do that again." The entire line went quiet. Tyrell puffed up. "Or what?" Frank didn't blink. "I won't warn you a third time." Mikey stepped in between them, grinning. "Whoa, whoa, easy there, Grandpa. You gonna throw a hip?" Even the guards looked up this time, but none moved. In here, they let things simmer. Frank picked up his tray, walked to the end of the hall. A few inmates started whispering. "What's his deal?" "He ain't normal, man. Dude just stares into your soul." But Tyrell couldn't stop now. He had a rep to keep, pride to defend. He couldn't let a damn senior citizen make him look weak. So that afternoon in the showers he made his move. Frank was alone, washing up in silence. The door swung open. Tyrell and Mikey walked in, towels in hand, but that wasn't what they came for. "You know, old man," Tyrell said, his voice echoing off the tiles, "you got a smart mouth for someone whose bones might snap if I blow too hard." Frank turned off the water, dried his face with a slow, methodical motion, said nothing. Tyrell stepped closer. "I'm gonna give you one chance. Apologize for disrespecting me in front of the others. On your knees." Frank looked at him. For a moment, his face almost softened. Almost. "Son," he said, voice like gravel, "don't do this." Tyrell smiled. "That's what I thought. You ain't got nothing left in you, do you?" And then, without warning, he swung. A right hook, fast and mean, headed straight for Frank's face, but it never landed. Frank moved, not wildly, not with panic. He shifted, calm, precise, and caught Tyrell's wrist mid-air. That's when Tyrell felt it. The grip. It wasn't just strong, it was trained. Pain shot through his arm like a bolt of lightning. Frank twisted the wrist, gently at first, then yanked it downward. Tyrell dropped to his knees with a gasp. Mikey jumped in, fists raised, but Frank had already stepped behind Tyrell and shoved him forward, into Mikey's gut. Both men hit the floor. The door opened. A guard stepped in, saw the mess, and paused. Frank raised his hands and calmly said, "They slipped." The guard looked at him, then at the two young men groaning on the floor. He said nothing, just turned and walked out. Tyrell couldn't sleep. That moment, when Frank caught his punch like it was nothing, kept replaying in his mind like a scratched record. It wasn't just the pain in his wrist. It was the look in the old man's eyes, not angry, not smug, just disappointed, like a father staring at a child who'd made a mess of something important. That humiliation burned hotter than any punch ever could. So Tyrell stewed and planned and waited. A week passed. Frank kept his routine, quiet, disciplined, predictable. But something in the air had shifted. The other inmates began giving him space. Not out of respect, not yet, but caution. They'd seen what he did, and no one could explain it. Tyrell hated that. He wanted the last word. The final move. He needed to show everyone that this wasn't Frank's story. It was his. And on that rainy Thursday afternoon, he made his choice. It happened in the corridor after yard time. The guards were distracted, half of them watching a fight that had broken out near the weight bench. The perfect moment. Frank was walking back to his cell when Mikey and Dre flanked him from behind. Tyrell was waiting just around the corner. It wasn't supposed to be a warning anymore, it was supposed to be a message. Mikey shoved Frank hard into the wall. The thud echoed across the hall. Frank hit the concrete with a grunt. Before he could rise, Dre was on him, yanking his arm behind his back. "Not so tough now, huh, old man?" Mikey sneered. Tyrell stepped forward, slowly, pulling something from under his shirt. A sharpened toothbrush. Crude. Illegal, but effective. He knelt beside Frank, who was still pinned, bleeding from his forehead. "You made me look weak," Tyrell whispered, in front of everyone. Frank didn't look scared, just tired. "You sure you want to do this, son?" he asked, voice hoarse. Tyrell leaned in. "Oh, I ain't just doing it, I'm enjoying it." He raised the shiv, and that's when Frank spoke the words that changed everything. "You ever hear of Firebase Ripcord?" Tyrell froze. "What?" Frank's lips curled ever so slightly. "Didn't think so." Then, like lightning, he moved. Even pinned to the floor, even bleeding, Frank's body erupted like it was still 1971. A twist of the hips, a shift of weight, and Dre was flipped over his own back, hitting the floor with a crunch. Before Mikey could react, Frank jabbed 2 fingers into his throat, just hard enough to make him stagger and choke. The shiv clattered to the floor. Tyrell stumbled back, eyes wide. Frank stood, slow and steady, blood dripping down his cheek, shoulders squared like a wall. And then, flash, dark green jungle, heavy rain, helicopters overhead. Young Frank, lean, focused, eyes like steel, charging through smoke. A comrade screams, pinned by gunfire. Frank doesn't hesitate. Fire, explosion, hand-to-hand combat. He lifts the wounded man over his shoulder. Bullets rip through the trees. Blood, mud, fire. Frank keeps moving. He doesn't stop. He never stops. 3 Purple Hearts. Over 200 combat missions. Instructor in close quarters combat. U.S. Marine 3rd Battalion 5th Regiment. Vietnam, Beirut, Panama. A ghost of wars no one talks about anymore. Frank's breathing calmed. Tyrell sat on the ground, staring up at him, chest heaving, mouth open, no words. Frank stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "I gave you warnings," he said. "I gave you chances." He looked down at the shiv, kicked it gently away. "I've buried men younger than you with better hearts." Tyrell couldn't speak, couldn't move. And then Frank leaned in, close enough for only Tyrell to hear. "You picked the wrong Marine." The guards finally arrived. Too late, of course. They took Mikey and Dre to the infirmary. Tyrell refused to speak, not a word. He didn't press charges. None of them did. Because what would they say? They got handled by a man almost 3 times their age. A man who didn't even look angry afterward. Just resolved. Back in the block, silence greeted Frank's return. Inmates parted as he walked to his bunk. No applause, no cheers, just silence. The kind given to men whose stories go deeper than skin. The kind of silence earned through survival. He sat on his bed, picked up his book, turned the page. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because now everyone knew Frank Morgan wasn't just some tired old man. He was something else, something dangerous. And justice? Justice was coming. The days that followed felt different. Something had shifted inside Blackridge Penitentiary. It wasn't visible, not on paper, not in reports, but in the way the men moved. In the way they looked over their shoulders when Frank walked by. In the way the guards began watching him just a little longer, like maybe they'd missed something big. Frank didn't change. He still rose before dawn, still folded his sheets perfectly, corners tight, still ate in silence, still sat in the corner of the yard, reading that soaked book, now dried, now sacred. But the world around him bent slightly. Respect began to take form, not with words, not with admiration, with space. Mikey came back from the infirmary with a bruised throat and a shattered pride. He didn't speak to Frank, didn't even look in his direction, just nodded when their paths crossed. A silent truce born of fear and understanding. Dre? He transferred blocks voluntarily. And Tyrell. Tyrell hadn't spoken a full sentence since the incident. He walked slower now, ate quieter, His swagger deflated. Something in him had cracked that day. He'd seen something ancient and brutal in Frank's eyes, and it haunted him. One morning during breakfast, a younger inmate named Harvey, skinny, nervous, no crew, approached Frank's table cautiously. "Hey, Frank didn't look up. I didn't see, but they said you used to be military?" Frank raised his eyes slowly. Not angry, not proud, just tired. "I was." Harvey shifted on his feet. "What branch?" Frank paused. Then, "Marine Corps." Harvey nodded like he'd just heard a ghost speak. "Thank you for your service," he said almost in a whisper. Frank blinked once, then nodded. That was all. Later that day, as the sun baked the yard, Frank sat in the shade near the edge of the basketball court. One of the guards, O'Donnell, a younger man, mid-30s, approached him casually. He knelt next to the bench, leaned close. "I checked your file." Frank didn't react. "Saw the service record," O'Donnell continued. "Vietnam, Beirut, Panama." Still no response. 3 Purple Hearts. Combat instructor, 30 years, retired lieutenant colonel. O'Donnell exhaled through his nose, impressed. "Why are you here, sir?" Frank finally looked at him, long and hard. "Wrong place, wrong time," he said. O'Donnell stood. "That's usually the story." Frank looked back toward the court. "No," he said softly. "This time it was mine. Desert highway. A diner." Frank, 15 years older than now, sits with his wife, laughing. A soft moment, normal life. Then gunshots. 2 masked men yelling, a robbery gone wrong. Frank reacts, fast, trained. Disarms one, but the other panics. A shot fired, blood. His wife crumples. Frank freezes. He takes down the second man, rage exploding. But it's too late. She dies in his arms. And the law sees a man who escalated violence, a Marine who should have known better. Charges, manslaughter, excessive force, prison. Back in the yard, Frank sat motionless. His hands didn't shake, his breath didn't waver, but his eyes, they were a battlefield, not of anger, of ghosts. That night a storm rolled in, thunder cracking, rain slamming the windows. Inside the block, something unexpected happened. Terrell approached Frank's bunk. He didn't come with crew. He didn't come loud. He just stood there, silent. Frank opened one eye. Terrell looked down, unsure, words caught in his throat. "I didn't know," he finally said. "I didn't know what you were." Frank sat up. "You still don't." Tyrell swallowed. I thought you were weak." Frank studied him, then nodded. "You weren't wrong," he said. "I am." Tyrell blinked, confused. Frank stood, towering now, despite the years. He leaned close. "You think strength is how hard you hit, how loud you talk. But real strength is surviving what tries to kill you and still being able to look in the mirror." Terrell didn't reply. He turned and walked away. But his world had shifted again. 2 days later, the guards called Frank to the warden's office. He entered slowly, stoic. The warden, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, motioned him to sit. "I've got 2 things for you, Morgan," the warden said. 1. A commendation from the Department of Defense. Apparently your service file was impressive." Frank said nothing. "And 2, the warden hesitated. "You've got a visitor." Frank's eyebrows raised slightly. "I don't get visitors." "Today you do." He entered the visitation room, sat down. Across the glass sat a boy, maybe 20, eyes green, nervous smile. "You don't know me," the boy said. "I'm Jake. I'm your grandson." Frank froze. The boy continued. "My mom was your daughter, Sarah. She never told me much. Just that you were a Marine. That something happened. I had to find you." Frank's face softened, the first real crack in the mask. "I didn't know she had a son. She passed last year. Cancer." Frank's hand slowly touched the glass. Jake mirrored it. And for the first time in years, Frank smiled. Just a little. He returned to his block, a different man. Still silent, still strong, but something inside him had shifted. The warrior had awakened. Not just to defend, but to live again. Frank Morgan was no longer just an inmate. He was a presence, a shadow, a legend in real time. Word had spread, not just about the fight, not just about the military past, but about who he really was. The war hero turned prisoner, the man who lost everything and still stood tall. Some called him the Ghost, others whispered Colonel as he passed. And Terrell? He watched from the corners now, silent, thin. Not the same man who once laughed at Frank in the cafeteria. The humiliation wasn't what broke him. It was the revelation. Because once you realize you've poked the devil in the chest, it's hard to ever breathe the same again. The guards began to change too. O'Donnell started bringing Frank books, military history, strategy, even old Marine handbooks. "Thought you might enjoy some reading," he'd say, pretending it was nothing. Frank would nod. Nothing more. But the respect was mutual. The older guard, Peterson, stopped calling him Inmate and started calling him Sir, not because he had to, because he couldn't help it. Still, the prison had its rules, and respect wasn't a currency everyone accepted. There was one group, older, more violent, deep in the block, that didn't buy into the rumors, led by a man named Lenny Pike. Mid-50s, life sentence, Aryan tattoos crawling up his neck like a disease. He didn't like that the attention had shifted, didn't like the whispering, didn't like the old man sitting alone and being left alone. That kind of quiet one was dangerous. And Lenny had a point to make. It started with the threats, scratched into Frank's door. "We see you, soldier. You bleed like the rest of us." Frank ignored them. Then came the accident. His bed, soaked with bleach, books torn apart, his toothbrush snapped. Frank stood in the middle of the cell that night, everything destroyed around him, breathing deep, not angry, not scared, just calculating. O'Donnell saw the footage, came to Frank the next morning. "We're investigating. I'll find out who did this." Frank looked up from his book. "No need." O'Donnell raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Frank nodded. "I'll handle it." The words were simple, but the weight behind them, heavy, like a war drum beginning to beat. That night the block was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that happens before something bad, or something righteous. Frank moved through the dark like he had a purpose, because he did. He found Lenny Pike near the laundry room, alone, cocky, armed with a sharpened screwdriver. "You think you're special," Lenny spat. "But you bleed like us." Frank didn't answer. He just stepped forward. Lenny charged, fast, but not fast enough. What happened next wasn't flashy. It was surgical, efficient. Frank deflected the lunge, redirected Lenny's momentum into the wall, used the man's own arm against him. In under 6 seconds, the screwdriver was on the floor, Lenny's wrist shattered, and his face pressed into the tile. Frank knelt beside him, whispering into his ear, "I don't fight because I enjoy it, I fight when I must." He twisted Lenny's arm just enough to send a message, not to cripple, but to make it unforgettable. "I'm not the enemy, but if you make me one, I end it quick." Then he let go, stood, walked away. No guards intervened. They saw everything on the cameras, and no one filed a report. Because in prison, sometimes justice wears old boots and grey hair. The next morning, Frank's books were replaced. No one claimed to have done it, but they were there, clean, neatly stacked. And on top, a folded Marine Corps flag, old, faded, reverently placed. Frank sat on his bunk, picked it up gently, ran his fingers along the stars. His hands didn't shake, but his eyes, a little wetter than usual. A week passed, then 2. Frank became something rare inside those walls, not feared, respected, and not because of violence, because of discipline, because of how he carried pain without inflicting it on others, because of how he taught the young ones, and not with speeches but through example. Tyrell started sitting closer in the yard, quiet, listening. Harvey began asking questions. "Did it ever scare you? War?" Frank looked at him, then back at the yard fence. "Every damn day," he said. Harvey blinked. "But you still went." Frank nodded. "That's the job." And that was all. One afternoon, a fight broke out near the lunch line. 2 younger inmates, wild punches flying, one of them pulling a blade. The guards moved slow. Too slow. Frank stepped in before they got there, grabbed the wrist holding the blade, disarmed, de-escalated. No show, no ego, just clean, practiced control. Even the guards were stunned. O'Donnell said later, "You're running this place better than we are." Frank replied, "That's not the goal." But they all knew. In a way, he was. That night, as the lights dimmed and the block went still, Tyrell approached Frank again. No mockery, no swagger, just words. "I was stupid," he said. "I didn't see you for what you were." Frank closed his book, looked him in the eye. "I'm not what I was," he said. Tyrell nodded. "Maybe, but you're still something most of us ain't ever been." Frank asked, "What's that?" Tyrell took a breath. "Solid." They shook hands. No audience, just two men, one learning, one remembering. Frank Morgan wasn't free, not legally, not by law. But inside those walls, he had something most men never find. Peace. Because for the first time in decades, he wasn't running from who he was standing in it. Weeks passed, then months. Black Ridge Penitentiary, always noisy, always violent, had started to feel calmer, not peaceful. This was still prison, but something had changed, and it started with one man. Frank Morgan didn't give speeches. He didn't lead groups. He didn't ask for anything, but his presence reshaped the air. He had become the eye of the storm, unmoved, unshakable. Inmates fought less. Guards listened more. Even the youngest, loudest troublemakers had begun watching Frank, trying to decode the quiet, because that quiet was heavy with history. Tyrell had changed more than most. No longer the loudest voice in the room, he spent his time shadowing Frank, sometimes walking beside him in the yard, sometimes just sitting nearby in silence. He started lifting weights more, reading, writing. One day he showed Frank a letter. "To my mum," he said. "First one I've written in 10 years. Frank read it, said nothing. But when he handed it back, he nodded once, and that meant everything. In Block C, a new rule formed, unofficial, unwritten. You don't touch the old man, not out of fear, out of respect. Even Pike, broken wrist still healing, didn't say another word. He just kept to his corner. That's how you know the lesson was real. Not because the fight was won, but because no one wanted to test it again. Frank's relationship with O'Donnell, the guard, grew deeper. Quiet camaraderie built on mutual understanding. One afternoon, O'Donnell asked something he'd been holding for a while. "If you had the chance to leave Pew, would you?" Frank looked out through the chain-link fence at the mountains beyond, then said, "Freedom's not always about gates." O'Donnell nodded. "But sometimes gates matter." Frank looked at him. "If I left, I'd have to carry all this with me. In here." He touched his chest. "At least I know who I am." "Still," O'Donnell smiled, "I hope they see what we see." "Maybe it's time someone told your story." Frank just went back to his book, but he didn't say no. The prison chaplain, Father Dorsey, asked Frank to speak once during a small gathering for Veterans Day. Frank declined. Then, the day of, he showed up anyway. He stood at the front, cleared his throat, and said only this: "I've buried brothers. I've watched boys become men in the worst places on earth. What I've learned is this: silence is a weapon, and sometimes mercy is the strongest thing a man can offer." Then he sat. No applause. Just silence. And that was louder than any standing ovation. Letters from his grandson Jake came every week now. Frank wrote back short messages, typed carefully on the block's ancient typewriter. "Eat well. Study hard. Don't be in a rush to grow up." Then one day the letter came with a photo. Jake, standing with a recruiter. "Thinking of joining the Marines, Grandpa?" Frank stared at it for a long time, folded it, put it in the breast pocket of his jumpsuit. Didn't say a word. But that night he didn't read his book, he just sat by the window, looking at the moon. One rainy afternoon the warden summoned him again. "You've got a visitor." Frank walked down the same hallway as before, entered the room, but this time it wasn't Jake. It was a man in uniform, formal, decorated. "I'm Colonel Davis, Department of Veterans Affairs. I've reviewed your case. The Defense Committee believes you were wrongfully prosecuted under outdated interpretations of use of force law. There's a motion for reconsideration." Frank blinked. Nothing more. But inside something shifted. Hope. Quiet. Measured. But real. 3 months later the motion was approved, and Frank Morgan, Marine war veteran prisoner, was free to go. The day he left, there was no celebration. No camera crew, no press. Just one guard, O'Donnell, walking him to the gate. "You sure you're ready?" he asked. Frank adjusted the collar of his worn jacket. "I've been ready since they put the cuffs on." O'Donnell opened the gate. "Take care of yourself, Colonel." Frank looked at him. "You too, son." And then he stepped into the cold morning air. The world was louder than he remembered. Faster. But he didn't rush. He took a bus, sat in the back, watched the towns pass by, and finally, he arrived. A small white house on a quiet street. The porch creaked. Jake opened the door. They didn't hug. They just looked at each other, and that was enough. Frank now spends his days in a workshop behind that house, fixing old radios, reading, writing letters to other veterans. Jake visits him every afternoon. They sit on the porch, sometimes talking, mostly just watching the world go by. In the corner of the workshop, a shadow box hangs on the wall, 3 purple hearts, a folded flag, and below it, a brass plate with 7 words, "Age is not weakness, it is fire." And if this story moved you in any way, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Frank's place. Because your voice matters, and sometimes the quietest voices tell the loudest truths.